All right, good afternoon. Yes, yes, good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you here. I was just chatting with some students, and we were talking about how this isn't just a break from law school. This actually is really at the heart of law school, being here, being together in community, and having these dialogues. So good afternoon. I'm Jasmine Gonzalez-Rose, a professor here and also the Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Engagement. And I'm very delighted to be able to welcome you all to today's installment of the Barbara Jordan Lecture Series on race, law, and inequality. Today, we are very blessed to have Yavilah McCoy, who's going to speak with us on facing history, uprooting racial inequality, and deepening housing justice within the law. Our own Dean, and Angela Onwachi-Willig, brought the Barbara Jordan Lecture Series to BU Law to foster deeper engagement with issues of race, racism, and the law. As a leader and as a scholar, she prompts us to consider both the law's role in perpetuating racism and other forms of subordination, and also utilizing law as opportunities to address and mitigate racism and other forms of subordination. The Barbara Jordan Lecture Series is in honor of a highly distinguished alumna from BU class of 1959, the very first African-American woman elected to Congress from the Deep South. The series is now endowed in perpetuity thanks to its generous gift from Gary Tischler, a graduate of the class of 1987. We are deeply grateful for his generous support of the law school and for funding this important lecture series, so this generation and future generations of BU Law students, faculty, staff, and community can hear from leading scholars and leaders on issues of race, law, and inequality. And it's my pleasure to welcome and to introduce our speaker. Yavilah McCoy is the CEO of the diversity consulting group, Dimensions, Inc. Through Dimensions, she services an international portfolio of clients in the area of education, philanthropy, and social justice. As an anti-racist educator and activist with an international platform, Yavilah provides training and consulting to numerous projects that span multiple identities and multiple communities. She brings a unique intersectional perspective to the ongoing work of racial justice and collective liberation. She is a pioneer of the Jewish diversity and equality movement and an advocate and mentor for the empowerment of a trans-global community of Jewish leaders of color. She is a trustee of the Irving Harris Foundation and has served on the steering committees of the Women's March and many other large-scale national movement efforts. We are delighted to have you here to hear your words, and I've already been inspired by you, and I look forward to more. Welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. So good to be with you. As has already been said, I'm Yavilah McCoy, and I am the CEO of Dimensions Educational Consulting. And what that means is that I run an organization that is pretty much led by Black women and people of color. And in forming an organization that in our bylaws and in our formation and in our systems creates opportunities for diversity, equity, and inclusion through community development programs for emerging Black women leaders, we actually have to both walk the walk and talk the talk in order to be successful in our work. So what we do is we have created an organization where we can use fee-for-service trainings. We get paid to do our work, but we reinvest that work into leaders who are multiracial, multicultural, and multi-faith, reflecting, innovating, strategizing, collaborating, and producing deeper equity and healing in themselves and in the world around them. So we are a majority people of color organization making a difference in the world by doing what we know and have practiced internally ourselves. Our highest calling in all the work that we do, and what I'm here to represent to you today as a leader of the organization, is that we are helping people to recover a deeper sense of their humanity through the work of equity. We're not asking people to be good Samaritans. We're not asking people to figure out how to be saviors. We're asking folks to look into yourself, look into your capacity for leadership, and do your best to recover a deeper sense of your own and others' humanity through the leadership that you can take. So that is what animates the work of Dimensions, and that is what brings me here with you today. Before I do any work with anyone, anywhere, because we take humanity so seriously, we ask people to check in on their humanity before we begin. So if you're having a really good day or you're having a really bad day, and then you have to come sit on the bench, that's going to make a difference sometimes to what happens next. Yes? So how seriously do you take your own humanity in the context of your leadership? Take it seriously right now for 30 seconds and check in. Given all that's happening in the world, all that is asking us to adapt, to manage, to look at the full range of feelings we're having: joy, sadness, anxiety, hope, uncertainty, boredom, grief, and celebration. What's coming up for you as you journey into this season and consider your leadership opportunities in this moment? So just find somebody next to you, and all I'm going to ask you to do is for 30 seconds, just check in for a second. How are you? And look, if you don't want to go deep because you don't know who you're talking to, and I'm not interested right now in having some deep conversation with somebody I don't know, then keep it simple. But at least check in. Check in. How are you? What comes up for you? And share what feels safe, okay? So just real quick, I'm going to time it, 30 seconds. Okay, if you haven't done so already, switch to the second person. How are you? Okay. So if I were to ask you the question, in what condition do you arrive at the prospect of working on racial equity? And I ask you to hold that within the context of a very simple question: how are you? How are we today? Anybody can volunteer at this point. I'll be talking probably for the rest of the lecture, but you have permission to speak now. How are you? Yeah. Yes. So being able to come into a space where other people are thinking about topics like this gives you hope, right? Even though there's a lot of other things maybe who are not giving you a lot of hope right now and that are beyond your control. It's good to name that in community because somebody else here is feeling the same way. What else? How are we at BU Law today? Warn. Come through. What does that mean? Yeah, yeah. The prospect of coming in and doing your job anyway, of holding it together and being resilient, of constantly being able to think and move your intelligence forward, regardless of what's happening underneath. Yeah, that's work that can be fraying and exhausting and cause you to be worn. What if that's the prospect at which we begin the work of racial equity? What happens next from there? Yeah. One more. I'm not asking because this is going to be a touchy-feely lecture. I'm actually because it really matters. How are we as we approach this topic? Yes. Yes.
So overwhelmed by gratitude that
Uh-huh.
although I might feel like the world is around me, that into this space, and that we are not just invited this.
Okay. So gratitude is something that might wake you up and cause you to smile. Yes? My grandmother used to say, I'm grateful to wake up in my right mind. That's a very simple thing to be grateful for. But to say that causes me to also then understand that not everybody gets that. Not everybody has the same opportunities. So being grateful for what you do have and taking opportunities to gather and celebrate that, yeah, that could change the prospect for how you approach racial equity. So I'm asking you to take that seriously, because the answers to how are you will also lead you to take seriously more deep and important questions about racial equity, which is how are you learning to lead and be? Are you approaching the work of racial equity with breath, or are you approaching the work of racial equity with anxiety? Are you approaching the work of housing justice from a place of deep understanding, or are you approaching the work of justice from a place of actually needing to release? Wherever you are in yourself is going to impact your ability to lead with others. So if somebody says racial equity and justice, and I go, yay, people might walk toward me. But if I say racial equity and housing justice, boy, is it really hard work. Who wants to come join me? And this is serious. So I want y'all to think about what is the embodiment of the work that you have to hold in order for us to be successful in really engaging in transformational change. So some of the ways that we do this, and we're not going to go through all of these because this is not a workshop. I'm actually here to teach you something today. I just want you to glance at these and notice in terms of how you approach the work, how you approach the access, power, and privilege you have to make change in society. Where are you thinking about these things as possibilities for your leadership? Where are you looking to make space and share space? Where are you looking to honor both your relationships and your tasks? Where are you paying attention to where you are focusing on yourself, but you're also being accountable to others in the work? Where do you or don't you have capacity to try on others' lived perspectives? I'm not going to read all of these, but I want you to, and I want you to take seriously, what is your capacity to show up in the work of equity with these things in mind? And then alongside this beautiful lecture that we get to have today, pick one that maybe you want to continue to work on even beyond the lecture. I'm also going to ask you to take seriously what you might have to agree to when it comes to holding intersectional equity. That means that when we're talking about race, we're not only talking about race. When we're talking about gender, we are not only talking about gender. When we're talking about religion and creating an anti-oppressive society, right? What are some of the things you have to hold in order to hold it all? Take a look at some of these. Where are you ready? And where are you in process? And if you have questions about any of these, you can ask me about them too. These all feel clear? Things that get us ready, get us prepped to be able to do the work of racial equity and justice? No one has any questions? Okay, BU's ready then. We're gonna see. Yes.
What do you mean by light and shadow?
So we're living in times right now where we are seeing lots of shadow in the context of our ability to hold each other's humanity, in our ability to be able to see and respect and invest in each other's dignity on so many different levels. And it probably is wearing a lot of people thin. But what shadow is the absence of light, which means it's in relationship with light. Anytime you see shadow, there's some light on the other side that's being refracted. So how do we approach the work of racial equity from that lens? Yes, we're seeing all the things that are hard, but where are we also celebrating all the things that are good? And to let both of those things be our teachers in the context of the way we move through the work. So when we were going through really hard times in this country during the Black-led uprising that animated a lot of the pandemic, a lot of my teachers would say, let your joy be as sacred to you as your sorrow as you continue in the work. That's an example of light and shadow being equally valuable teachers. Cool? Any other questions on this? All right. So you can hold on to these. Just remember what sparked a thought or what sparked some interest in you, and hold on to it as something that you can continue to explore. I want to acknowledge before we begin today my partners, my allies, my colleagues who have helped to infuse the presentation we're going to do today, because we're never doing the work alone. And even though I may stand up here and be able to wax eloquent, I want you to know where wisdom and information comes from. So you can find more on the topics that I am going to discuss today at the Center on Race, Inequality, and Law at New York University School of Law, Policy Link, Facing History, Uprooting Inequality, in the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Housing Matters, and Urban Institute Initiative, C4 Innovations Initiatives on Equity and Homelessness, and on Eden Housing, which I've been in partnership doing deep work around racial equity. So the topic for today is Facing History, Uprooting Racial Inequality and Deepening Housing Justice Within the Law. If we go to our colleagues at the Center on Race, Inequality, and Law at New York University School of Law, what they're saying is that our job in navigating the intersection between race, inequality, and the law is to actually confront the laws, policies, and practices that lead to the oppression and marginalization of people of color. Many people assume that laws are race neutral, but the way you know whether a law is race neutral or not is to look at its outcomes. So if we are living every day where laws that lead to the oppression and marginalization of people of color have become normative, have become expected, then we have work to do. They believe and teach us to know that the racism that permeates our present-day legal system has deep roots. You ever tried to pull a weed up in the yard and you thought it was going to be a quick thing, and then you pulled and it pulled back? Okay, so it's kind of like that as we're trying to pull out the weeds within our present-day legal system to clear it of racism. And so as we think about that, we have to elevate the stories of those affected by race-based inequality and rigorously apply a racial lens to analyzing unremitting disparities. So it means you don't look away from where you see disparities in the law. You actually look into it. You actually examine. And then we're going to identify, based on doing that examination, actionable, forward-looking solutions to address the injustices caused by racism and inequality. So I'm here today to help sharpen your lens. What are you seeing? What are you not seeing as a weed, essentially, that needs to be pulled up in the context of the way we move around housing justice? So where are we at? What's the context? I put a lot of words here today because you didn't have a pre-packet. Do not read these slides. I do not want you sitting here like this is a textbook. I'll walk you through it, but this is a reference so that you can also know this is where I can go to get a little bit more information. So National Alliance to End Homelessness lets us know that in 2023, people of color are disproportionately more likely than white people to experience homelessness in the US. People talk about homelessness and they say, oh, it's homelessness, it's just a US problem. Homelessness is a racial equity issue. The most striking disparity can be found among African Americans, who represent 13% of the general population, but account for 37% of people experiencing homelessness and more than 49% of homeless families and children. So our colleagues at C4 Innovations at NYU are saying this is something that we have to uproot in order to deepen housing justice. But in order to do that, we have to look at what are the ways that racism permeates not just housing, but every institution in the US and denies millions of the right to a fair and just society in which they can thrive and prosper. If we become myopic and we assume what we're looking at housing justice is a disparity that's only going to exist in the system of housing justice, we're going to find ourselves out of sync with the truth of what has to be changed. So systemic discrimination and racism have resulted in disparities in the ways housing programs and homeless services have impacted diverse populations. But the key is to know that when people of color experience homelessness, trauma, substance use, and mental health challenges, this is the intersectionality. These are all woven into what actually is the condition of being homeless and of color in the US. Their housing stability is further undermined by our existing racism, discrimination, and stigmas. So deepening housing justice is an opportunity for all of us to understand the factors that drive housing inequities and then to lean into opportunities to alter them and achieve transformative outcomes. So pulling it out by the root is going to be about looking at person-centered, recovery-oriented, and trauma-informed approaches that allow us to hold the person in the need for justice. It's also an opportunity for us to engage in anti-racism. How many of y'all have been reading Kendi? This is the law school, right? I want to see more hands than that. So Ibram Kendi has been talking to us at least for the last 5 years about anti-racism. And what he's saying is that anti-racism is a practice. Many people say, I want to be an anti-racist. But in order to be an anti-racist, you have to understand it's not just an identity that somebody's going to stamp on your forehead. It's a way in which you engage the world by saying, I don't get to be neutral from the systems where racism is being made normative. It says that there is no in-between safe space of I'm not racist. It means there's no claim of neutrality that is able to mask racism. It means that we don't make racist a bad word and the equivalent to a slur. It means that we are always engaged in saying, is this system racist or is it not, based on the outcomes of groups of people and the impacts that systems of powers and policies are having on them. We are always in that questioning space. So if we want to do that, and if we want to approach housing justice from the place of, in this system, are there outcomes in housing justice, and the need for housing justice, are there outcomes that are disparately impacting people of color? And if they are, is this racism that has to be deterred, undermined, dismantled, or not? So I brought you housing justice and racial inequity in California. How many of you traveled to California recently? Anybody seen what's happening on the streets of California recently? Okay, so this is no big secret. California is the world's 5th largest economy, and it's a global center for real estate investment. And yet California is increasingly unable to provide the most basic human need, safe, stable, and affordable housing to huge swaths of its population. Today, over 3 million renter households are being charged more than they can afford for rent, and that state has the largest homeless population in the country. With this problem, while this problem affects all Californians, what we're seeing is a racial equity issue because people of color are disproportionately homeless, housing insecure, and burdened by unaffordable rents. So when we say we want to work on racial equity, do we look to California and the people of color that are unhoused as a racial equity issue? One place that we can look to with hope is that there was a group, I don't know anybody heard of the case Moms for Housing? Just a couple of hands. So what I want you to look at in this case that I brought you is the intersection between people power, legislative power, and activist power. Moms for Housing actually were a group of people who were homeless in Oakland, California. And it was a group of Black women. And what they did is they moved their families into a vacant 3-bedroom house as squatters without permission of the owner, which was Wedgwood Properties, and essentially stayed there until they were evicted to highlight the idea that the number of vacant properties so far exceeds the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in California, in this case, Oakland specifically, that this is a human rights issue. So what's interesting is how did we get systemically to the case of Westwood Properties being able to buy 2928 Magnolia Drive in Oakland, California for $501,000 at a foreclosure auction? What I would ask you to look at are what are the laws, and we'll see this in a little bit more, but what are the laws that are encouraging companies to prospect, that's what it's called, to go into low-income communities and buy properties and leave them vacant and empty for the sake of turning over a profit. Imagine you're homeless and you're looking at a home that you could live in. You can't afford to buy a home making $49,000 or $39,000 a year, which is what women, Black women, and Latinx women of color are making in San Francisco Bay Area. So you are priced out of the community that you grew up in, but you're looking at an empty house that you could live in, that you're willing to pay for if it was affordable housing, and it's sitting empty for years, waiting for a company to turn over a profit. This is what Moms for Housing pushed against. And so what's important to know is that they won. In September 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law Senate Bill 1079, inspired by the experience of Moms for Housing, that prohibits bundled foreclosure sales of residential properties to a single buyer at auction. Essentially, the law found the predatory practices of real estate to be unjust. And so they did something about it. And in the cases that we're going to find where housing justice intersects with racial justice, you may find that there are people in the grassroots activism space who are pushing against that injustice, literally with their bodies, literally by putting their lives and their children into places of peril to be able to make things better and different. And this is an opportunity for you to lean in and figure, what is our power to support those folks with the law? So if we're going to talk about policies, COVID-19, right? What did we learn based on COVID-19? Policy Link, Amy Chu and Chione Lucina Munoz-Flegal, said that if we are to emerge from our inherited and ongoing housing, COVID-19, and racial injustice crises stronger and more resilient, we're going to need to create a different reality. I asked you, in what condition do you arrive at the work of racial equity? In order to be able to imagine that you can create a different reality, you have to be able to arrive with some perspective of hope, some perspective that allows you to imagine more than you see right now, some belief that something that you do can actually matter and make a difference. So what they're asking us to imagine is housing not as a commodity that enriches our pocketbooks, but as an essential basic human need in America that we all should have. Has that ever been true? Have y'all ever lived a life where that was true in this US of A? So calling for imagination is exactly what we need. How do you imagine the role of the law? How do you imagine your power and agency to make it possible that we all get to be housed as a basic need? What are we working with? The speed and scale of housing speculation has actually increased. What I just described to you happened to Moms for Housing is happening all across the countries. And it's supported by government policies that actually have encouraged and incentivized real estate speculation. Now, the best example of real estate speculation was what? In our lifetimes. What happened to us when real estate speculation got out of hand? Prior to COVID-19, it was the biggest debacle we lived through as a country. What was it? Come on, open up your mouths. Okay, right? The housing crisis, Wall Street actually creating predatory subprime lending, and the ensuing foreclosure crisis that actually totally gutted our economy and sent waves of disaster, not just through the US, but all across the globe, because we were not thinking about government policies that actually were encouraging speculation and not regulating it in ways that allowed all of us to be protected. Now, the government is also implicated on a lot of other things, but also in the fact that the people we are putting into office and the ways that we are voting have allowed federal, state, and local governments to dramatically cut spending on affordable housing while encouraging increased reliance on the private sector for housing production. This is not just the government, this is us if we're not paying attention to it and how we vote. Federal funding for the operation and upkeep of public housing declined 37% since 2003, while Section 8, community block grants, and other funding has also been cut severely. So the support for affordable housing formerly provided through state-mandated set-asides for redevelopment funds have also disappeared. This is directly impacting communities of color. What are you looking at? Y'all know what you're looking at? What is this a map of? Detroit. In what way? This is a government map. What did it do? What are the red boxes? Undesirable neighborhoods, right? These are neighborhoods where it's not necessarily advised that you invest. Here are others that can be zoned possibly for industrial or mixed use, and these are the ones that are the best residential neighborhoods that we should live in. So we have to realize that we've come through a history where housing itself has actually been delegated by the government in defining neighborhoods as residential, commercial, industrial, mixed use, places where residential housing can be restricted, places where the Department of Housing and Urban Development can actually be a robust player, and places where it cannot. So our history of housing itself and creating disparate opportunities around housing through governments have created unfairness, and racially disparate effects on housing patterns. Now, I live in Newton, and if I talk to my neighbors, we're the only people of color for years and years who have ever lived within a 10-block radius until one person moved in and they wanted to know, was he my cousin? Now, is that a random fact? Is it random that there are so many white people in majority in the suburbs of Boston, but concentrated in other areas of Boston? If we're going to talk about housing justice, we have to acknowledge that it's lenders, it's government, it's real estate moguls, it's redlining, It's folks making choices around what houses they're going to show you and what houses they're not. All of that is creating conditions of racial inequity that can lead to the conditions that we're seeing now of excessive homelessness. It's not random. If people actually wanted to get support, this is from the Center on Race and Equality, the law of racial segregation and housing policy. If you wanted to actually use Section 8, people know what Section 8 is? Okay, so people think that is creating deeper housing justice in the US, right? But if you actually have Section 8, you will only have the ability to use that housing choice voucher in areas where people allow private landlords to be able to use those funds. So being that most Section 8 participants are people of color, with Black households represented in the program at disproportionately high levels, even if Section 8 participants of all races were treated equally, which is not necessarily the case, any shortcomings or inequities that are manifest by the choices of which landlords will and will not take Section 8 are going to impact disparately where Black families get to live. So you think it's just my personal choice, right? Well, I'll take Section 8 or I won't. But these choices are literally creating neighborhoods where people of color are actually being bunched, being put under similar conditions, and being put at risk for homelessness because of the conditions that where a Section 8 housing might show up, because of those conditions. And we have to be paying attention to it. So we know, because there's lots of studies that have been put through around HUD, that racial discrimination has long been a mainstay of the public housing system. Historically, public housing was often explicitly segregated. White tenants in public housing were placed in housing unit in white neighborhoods. Black tenants, if allowed to access public housing at all, were placed in housing units in Black neighborhoods. So just again, even not just through Section 8, but through the way HUD has manifest in our housing justice system, Black people are put with other Black people, and then the conditions of where Black neighborhoods, quote unquote, are formed replicate systems that put people at housing risk. The other thing that's happening right now in the law that you all should be paying attention to are changes to basic protections that give people no entitlement to stable or affordable housing. So during the 1970s, following a surge of tenant activism through the 80s and the 2000s, the real estate industry succeeded in limiting and eroding local rent control measures, as well as guards against displacement. So when you see homelessness, it's actually the result of ways that people have been eroding local rent control measures for the past 30, 40, 50 years. So even though there's been legislation that has helped us to get rent caps last year, renters continue to lack strong rent control protections, meaning people can change how much rent they pay at any time. They lack stability and healthy safeguards, and these gaps disproportionately hurt people of color, the majority of whom are renters. The other thing that's a racial equity issue is the criminalization of homelessness and community of color. When you walk and you see someone on the street and they're homeless, and then you create the intersection of being homeless and being of color, what is the impact of the assumptions, of the stigmas that come through around criminalization? Is it a crime to be homeless and of color? It obviously is, because right now we have widespread nuisance ordinances that are being used to evict or expel low-income tenants of color, and to also target people who are without homes based on racist narratives, based in the perception that criminal behavior is a direct equal sign to people who don't have housing. Land use. Wealthier municipalities that are primarily white have traditionally limited the development of affordable and multifamily housing. So let's say we live in a community where it's possible that we could use land differently. Many folks within those communities who are wealthier and primarily white actually create resistance to that. If you've lived here over the last 5 years, as I have in Newton, we've seen that resistance locally. Anybody know about the resistance to their being created apartments and multifamily dwellings in Newton? Yes? Save our towns. So this is not uncommon, but as a result, pressure has increased around housing costs and instability. And as people are displaced within communities, which literally is what's happening in California, people of color who are in low-income households have lower opportunities to be able to gain even the most basic services, like housing that has safe drinking water, housing that is not exposed to hazardous industries, housing that actually allows people to have safe and healthy conditions in which to raise their families. So we have to think about land use and the way in which we preserve land use for certain people under certain conditions and leave others behind. There's profit here. From the subprime mortgage crisis that tore through communities of color to the disproportionate concentration of corporate landlords, properties, and neighbors of color, the real estate industry has targeted predatory and discriminatory practices at people of color. So these practices are not driven not only by personal prejudices, but also because it helps them to gain a profit. As a result, discriminatory profiteering, renters and homeowners of color often pay more than whites for less. So we're looking at rising incomes. We're looking at declining wages. All of these are worsening housing costs. So because people cannot afford housing in certain neighborhoods, many people of color are being forced to move farther and farther away from their jobs and centers of employment to find a home that they can afford, leading to higher transportation costs and increased greenhouse gas emissions while tearing at social and community bonds. So this is if you're looking for ways to connect housing justice to racial inequity, I've just given you maybe 10 different ways in which it's manifest in the way people of color are moving through the housing justice system. But the question around imagination is, how are we using our education and power to transform systemic inequity into equitable housing outcomes? So these are your opportunities. Where do you have opportunities to learn the history of race and housing discrimination and its impact on housing stability for marginalized populations? Ding, 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 this is one. But where are others? Where are you looking to understand the impact of discrimination, racism, and racial trauma on people of color who experience housing instability and homelessness disproportionately? So before you came into this room and you were thinking about housing justice, did the impacts, the specific and disparate impacts on people of color come to mind? Where are you understanding the impact of racism on housing policies, programs, services, and outcomes? That's something else we talked to today. Where have you been able to collect, identify, and assess data and disaggregate data to differentiate populations that are most marginalized by homelessness and housing instability? This is where you will get to understand the story of racial inequality. Where, when it comes to issues of housing justice, are you asking staff and board members within organizations dedicated to housing justice to examine their understanding of diversity, inclusion, and equity? If people are sitting around a table who have no exposure to the idea that diversity, equity, and inclusion actually contribute to your worldview, contribute to the decisions you're going to make next, how does that in and of itself impact our prospects for housing justice? Where are we creating opportunities to lead conversations, listening sessions, structured interviews about racism with staff, board members, service providers, community leaders, and those serving the housing justice field? Where are you updating operations, policies, and procedures? Where are we shifting organizational culture? Where are we building shared accountability? This is something any of us can do where we have power and leadership. This is an example of an organization that worked on housing for a year to actually do some of the things I just showed you, and some of the ways in which they deepened their commitment to racial equity and housing justice. I just wanted you to look for a second at what it means practically for those who have the power to make change to shift in regard to racial justice. What are some of the things you're noticing that they're committing to? Remember, these are organizational behaviors, ways in which people are making shifts to systems change, shifts to policies. What do you see they're committing to do that allows them to align with racial justice? Let's pick out some of the words. Yes.
I was gonna say, it seems
Okay. Okay, so to go from the other sphere, right, of all of this policy information Yavilah has given, to where can we actually take action, you actually have to be willing to take action. So we advocate. Within our work, we are advocates, right? But what are they advocates for? Take the top one. What are they advocates for?
Building diverse communities.
If the inequity is that there are exclusive land use policies and housing discrimination in our systems, and you're working on housing justice, you've got to be an advocate to eliminate the effects of that inequity and to really look for places where you can do so. That's a shift. What's another one? This is just an exercise for you all too, to get out of the headiness of it and into the action-oriented space of it. What's another action that these really good meaning people decided to take on? Yes. Who's doing the work? If you're sitting around with a bunch of people who are not directly proximate to the issue, what is the likelihood that those people are going to just, a light bulb is going to go off and we're going to know exactly how to do this work and who we need to do it with and when do we need to do it? No, actually, some of the work is changing who's sitting around the table so that we have better information around what needs to happen next. That's an action they decided to take. What else? Yeah. Yeah. In our privilege, sometimes we make highfalutin statements. We will be the next generation of. Okay, people need houses, right? That's what the inequity is here, right? They need houses. So we're going to build those houses. That's getting proximate and taking action. Are you getting the gist of what it means to move from hypothetical understanding of racial injustice in housing to actually being anti-racist in housing by taking action to disrupt systems? That's some of what you see in this commitment. It's some of what all of you can do too, if you'll gather together to figure out what your role is in not just understanding an idea, but actually being active in making transformational change. So just make sure you've read it through, see if there's anything that sparks your heart, sparks your mind around things that you might be able to do with your agency and power. Okay. So what about law and policy? You all are people who are engaged with law. You're people who will have the power to change policy, hopefully, with the access that you gain through your careers. In law, what we're after, based on Policy Link, is the idea that we need to establish a right to housing. Instead of saying, okay, let's fix the lack of housing, what does it mean to actually live into the idea that housing is a human right? What would laws need to look like to make that true? If we're going to rein in speculation, what would just laws need to look like to protect housing from the financial sector? And you all get to think about that. And possibly even as an imaginative exercise, craft What would new and imaginative legislation that actually protects housing from the financial sector look like? What would it look like to protect and increase the supply of permanently affordable housing? That's something we can be thinking about as well. What would it look like for us to be the ones to write the legislation that expand renter protections and end punitive discriminatory policies? What would it look like in the law to stop punishing poverty and homelessness? Oops, that's not what we wanted to do. What would it look like to protect homeowners from predatory lending and wealth stripping? What would it look like in the law to support development without displacement? What would it look like to use the law to enact progressive tax reforms? What would it look like to ensure low-income communities of color guide planning and decision-making? Looking back to the commitment that the housing organization made of who gets to sit around the table. What would it look like to understand that we're in this work to repair past harms and to really apply that to every level of government? So that's the work of systems and policies. This is your work, because if we're going to say we want to be anti-racist in the context of housing justice, it begins with people. And people in our country, according to Bryan Stevenson, have to get more proximate to issues of race and injustice. Bryan Stevenson has made huge changes to the law around mass incarceration. And the way he's done that is by listening. And if you've read his book, Just Mercies, he says that after listening to this man and seeing how he was treated, I came to a realization that we cannot create justice without getting close to the places where injustices prevail. We have to get proximate. So are people who are without housing just that person you step over on the street? Or are you proximate to the conditions like I've shown you today that actually contribute on a daily basis in ways that we allow to be normative to that condition actually being a possibility for folks we live with? One of the great reveals during the pandemic was that many people believed that, oh, the policies around healthcare, the policies around housing, the policies around who goes to work and who doesn't go to work, all these things were race neutral, right? Until you saw what the color was of most of the people who were in Shaw's. I remember one day during the pandemic, I went into Star Market and I was already just like, maybe plussed because I couldn't get toilet paper. Who knows what my problem was that day. But at some point, as I was moving around with my mask, trying to get my products out of the store, I looked up and I noticed that the majority of the cashiers and the majority of the people restocking the shelves were people of color. And that had never been my reality in Newton. Why were all the people of color now still working during the pandemic here in my town? Racial disparities. Who can't afford to stay home? Who has to go to work because they need a paycheck? Who actually doesn't have insurance and therefore must? Yes? So when we look at the policies around housing justice, it's the same thing. There is no policy that's race neutral when you look at the outcomes of how those policies impact people's lives. From slavery to segregation, African Americans have been systemically denied rights and socioeconomic opportunities. This is a basic fact. Other minority groups, including Indigenous and Latinx people, share similar histories, but the disproportionality in homelessness among people of color is a byproduct of the way we've experienced systemic inequity. The lingering effects of racism continue to perpetuate disparities in critical areas that impact the rates of homelessness. When we're talking about poverty, right? Poverty is a contributor to homelessness. You're looking at 10.8% and 7.6% people of color who are more likely to live in poverty. This is the source from the US Census Bureau. When we talk about slavery and critical race theory and all the ways in which we're going back and saying what did and did not happen in this country, what we're also erasing is the idea that slavery itself was part of a system that generated national and global economies. And that as we participated in that system in American history, we also participated in the generation of income in oppressive forms. One of those ways was debt slavery. We talk about people losing their homes, right? But that goes all the way back to the sharecropping system in the South. In the South, coming out of slavery, not only could you not own your home, you had to work the land that you used to be a slave upon and give all your profits from that land every year to the person who owned your land, right? But you never broke even somehow. Somehow, in the ways that the debt slavery was created, you always owed more than you produced. And that also contributes to this idea of homelessness. If I can't ever get ahead, if I can never make enough money to save, if I'm always just at that edge in the context of the way I navigate capitalism, debt slavery that we inherited all the way back from slavery is still alive and well in our systems right now. Ibram Kendi says the origins of racism cannot be separated from the origins of capitalism. So if we make not talking about capitalism a thing, then we cannot understand what it means to be truly separated from a life of racism. Ta-Nehisi Coates is also talking about housing justice and racial justice as a case for reparations, because another truth in our history is that we've had 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, and 60 years of separate and equal, 35 years of racist housing policy. Until we can reckon with our compounding moral debts, America is not going to be whole. So our job is to think about how we can work together on housing equity to break the chains of our history of injustice, enslavement, and exploitation. And so I think I'm going to stop there, and I will let you ask some questions. What do you feel like your entry point is to the work of housing justice?
Thank you. So in Massachusetts, there's a right to shelter law, but the governor is instituting a cap that's being challenged in court on the family shelter system. And so I've been hearing a lot about it, but I was wondering what the enforcement of the right to shelter law or a right to housing law would look like in practice, given that I feel like the governor has been saying, kind of throwing up her hands and being like, well, the shelters are full and the federal government isn't giving us enough money. And so what would a restorative justice oriented solution to that look like?
So restorative justice solutions applied in systems always ask three questions. Who has been harmed? Who is being harmed? That means that there have to be studies that show, based on the law that we're about to enact, who has been harmed, right? Who's at the center of the need for justice within that law? Then the question is, what does repair look like? Based on having spoken to the people, based on having listened to the people, right, who are experiencing the impacts of that law, what do they say repair would look like? And then the third thing is transformation. Where in the context of enacting the law, based on what we actually have information and data on now, and based on what we can project based on what similar laws have had outcomes for in the past, where are we able to see transformation? These three things are often missing from the majority of the legislation that we are putting forward. This is where activists come into the role, right? Because Mamas for Housing, people would have said, well, you just got to go through the system and find a place. And I know you and your baby are on the street, but we're doing the best we can. Instead, what they did is they pushed against the law to say, this is how we can make the law work for us. If we don't have that data and we don't have those relationships, and our governors or our legislators are not being held accountable to those three things that I just described to you around restorative justice, you're going to see outcomes still that are inequitable. So I would say, as folks who have legal opportunities to be able to do that kind of work, spend time holding the law accountable to those three points, if you can. Yes.
Well, thank you for a really powerful presentation today.
Yes.
And I appreciated your focus on housing justice. And I imagine you could have given another hour-long talk on other areas where we see disparities, like health justice or criminal justice, and we see racism reverberate almost wherever you look.
Yes.
But at the same, I'm cognizant that this sort of phase of anti-racism work is really setting forth a profound political agenda, one that other might be called a radical political agenda. If we were to actually eliminate housing disparities and outcomes,
Yes.
would need a government that's a lot different than even California or Massachusetts, where these problems are severe, but we have very progressive governments on the status quo scale of progressive. So it speaks to me that if we want profound changes in outcomes, we need a profound political movement to get us there. And so the question is, have you thought about what the political movement that gets us from point A to point B looks like, and the role of white progressive folks and black folks in that political movement?
So I had the opportunity recently to be in a room with congressmen who actually asked me similar questions. So if we really want to, live into racial justice, equality, why don't you tell us what we're supposed to do? Literally, they wanted a list. Tell me these 5 things that we're supposed to do. And I actually said something similar to what I just said to this young woman, which is, you assume that just because you have a job, you are the best situated person right now in the country to be responsive to these issues. You may have degrees, you may even have been elected, but if you are not proximate to the people who are being directly impacted by the laws that you make every day, and you are not holding those stories as essential to your humanity, there's nothing you're going to do next that this country is going to trust. And I think that's the issue. We are not holding our government accountable to remain proximate to the people in terms of how they move the work of governance forward. We are giving up. We've become so disappointed by the ways in which we're seeing legislation show up as not listening to us, not holding us, right? So we just say, well, if we can only get this. You want to see real radical change in this country? We're going to have to actually show up and believe that we can get our governance proximate to the people enough that they will remain accountable to us, no matter what happens when they get to the Hill. And unfortunately, I think that's up to us to make more true than waiting for them to wake up with a light bulb. So I think it's possible. Moms for housing, right? I think it's possible. I think it's going to have to be a change in our ability to trust and believe in what our imagination can carry us forward to. And a lot of us are tired. So maybe first a little bit of rest, a little bit of renewal, a little bit of investment in our resilience and solidarity as a nation, and then let's get to it. What else are you curious about in regard to this issue? Yes.
So what I appreciated most I appreciated all of your talk, but I most appreciated the story of Moms for Housing and the way they were able to take that bold step. I'm a tax guy, so I know the stories of all the ways the tax law has been shaped, it's usually by privileged white couples who say, I don't like that law, and they make their way to the Supreme Court, and either they win there, and that's happy, or Congress says, I'm so sorry for what happened to you in your laws, so I'll fix the law for you.
Right.
Is what you see in Moms for Housing something that we can be hopeful to see more of, that kind of action? Or are we likely to see the continuation of the pattern where there are people taking action and getting results, but it's going in the wrong direction?
Yeah. There's a backstory to Moms for Housing that I think is super important, which is that It wasn't random that they did what they did. They were actually working with local community organizers who for a long time had been trying to win legislation to try to get them housing, and they were losing. And I believe they had hit a point where the discussion was, look, I can't move quick enough to get you the housing that you need. But if we're strategic about how we insist that housing is our basic right, we may be able not just to win housing for you, but to bring housing for all of us. So are you willing to take the risk? These people took on a lot of risk. They moved themselves, they had 1-year-old children, they moved in, they actually invested in started paying the utilities and fixing up the housing. They did a lot of things to put their bodies on the line to try to make this possible. Again, it comes back to what the gentleman asked. Do we have enough hope and belief still in our power as a people that we can hold our government and its laws accountable to us by making them more proximate to our stories? The law isn't just the law. There are human beings behind the law. Real people, real lives, real experiences that should be shaping the law. And when we give up, we don't give the law a chance to speak for us. So is it possible? Yeah. Am I seeing a lot of tired people across the country? Absolutely. So we're gonna have to do an investment in holding each other up, in being the ones that say to people, keep going. I'm here to share power with you. I'm here to be the one to use my access and privilege to be able to make your life a little better. These are life choices we have to make as Americans. And the more of us who do that, the more possibilities there are. I haven't given up entirely on this country. I think everybody here can be a part of making a difference. Yes.
I come at this from a criminal law standpoint. So my first thought was mass and Cass, and
Yeah.
how, as a community, we've responded by, let's try having a criminal session right there. Let's just try wiping them away and see if they come back. So for me, my question is, I guess, given what we see right now as a housing issue for Mass and Cass, it's not. It's a housing issue, it's a criminal justice issue, it's a mental health, it's all of those things. How, or do we dismantle the issues and attack, or is it just we need a wholesale, if we could just magic wand it, new systems entirely? I don't know if that my question actually comes across, but.
Yeah, new systems entirely. We're gonna be here for a while. I'm a person who believes in working within the system to be able to enact change, and pacing ourselves around what is the change that would bring the most immediate relief to the pain and to the trauma that people are experiencing over lack of equity. When it comes to mass incarceration, the way that intersects directly with homelessness is that there are laws actually on the books in many states that say that if you have even had a misdemeanor, if you have come in any way in contact with the law, you are no longer able to have the right of affordable housing. You can no longer have Section 8 or HUD. You can no longer even live in this building, because if the landlord has to report who's living in the building and has to show what your criminal history is, the landlord could lose their rights to have government funding by saying that there's somebody who has any type of relationship to criminal justice system in their buildings. So we actually criminalize humans based on their relationship to the criminal justice system that is actually a criminal injustice system. The ways in which racial injustice actually permeates the criminal justice system. It becomes a fish eating its tail, right? So the beginning, if we start, remember today in my talk, I showed you both personal goals for impact and systemic goals for impact. On the personal goals for impact, we have to go to Bryan Stevenson. And should human beings be judged perpetually based on the worst thing that they've ever done? Can we continue to embrace their humanity and remain proximate to people who have come through the incarceration system and the criminal injustice system of the US? on an everyday, we are given choices in terms of how that works. We're giving choices by who gets to work in our institutions. We're giving choices by who gets to live in our neighborhoods. By if we have the opportunity to rent to people, how do we set up rental opportunities, right? Now, when we get to make those choices as individuals, there are a series of pull-down assumptions that are coming up in our own minds and hearts, right? Around the humanity of people who have been formerly incarcerated. Guess what? Same things are coming up in our legislators' minds. So if we're going to actually make change, we have to tell the stories of where we've taken the risks socially to be more deeply proximate and connected to the humanity of all people. And I don't know if you know the work of Tina Cherry, or if you know the work of, I think it's Moms for Justice, I think, out here, right? These are people who do the Million Moms March every, is it summer? Early summer, right? And what they're doing is they're actually talking about restorative justice in the context of not giving up on people who have actually brought harm to communities, but creating opportunities for healing and repair so that whole communities can continue to thrive. These are things that are happening around us all the time. Are y'all engaging in those things? Are you looking for opportunities to tell those stories, to live those stories, to be proximate to those stories? When legislators see us doing the work of being more proximate to the things that we value, it also changes the way they feel accountable to how they vote. So there's work we can do on an everyday. We may not be able to change the whole system, but there are ways that we can change through our assumptions, through our orientations, through our proximity to people who have come through the criminal justice system. We can change the way those people are valued and the way their humanity is recovered. So that's what I would say in regard. So I think we're out of time. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion today. I hope it's brought you a little bit of light and love. And I welcome you to the work of remaining accountable. Thank you so much.